Welcome to Security in the Fast Lane, a monthly conversation on improving security outcomes, creating a culture of security, and building subject matter expertise. Brought to you by White Hat Security with your host, Setu Kulkarni. Joining him today is Matt McLarty, Global Leader of API Strategy at MuleSoft.
It was 2012, and the Summer Olympics had pretty much, I'd say, entirely occupied the attention of everyone around the world, but more so in London. It was about which country was on the medal tally, but for Londoners, or at least the Londoners I knew as friends, it was all about getting tickets to get into the Olympic Stadium to literally view any event they could. It didn't matter if it was boxing or fencing. What really mattered was getting a ticket to the event. Tickets would open up online at unpredictable hours, and there was no way one could get a ticket without paying the huge cost of missing work or missing sleep. Now, one of my friends and colleagues was super determined to get a ticket into this once-in-a-lifetime type event. After all, we were all lucky to be in London during the year of the Olympics. So he did what any engineer could do, but would not regularly do. He managed to discover the ticket API for the Olympics website that sat behind their website. And what he did was he wrote a simple probe that checked for when the ticket API was online for business, and the probe would then send him an email notification. All he had to do then was to make sure he got online as fast as he could and got a ticket. That, my friends, was almost 10 years ago. Now, over the last 10 years, I've personally been a participant and a beneficiary of what folks call the API economy. However, as I switched over to the security industry, I've had a rather dichotomous relationship with APIs. I know folks who buy and use security products, and they want their security products to be API first, which is totally understandable, and I actually appreciate that kind of forward thinking in their minds. But when the same community of buyers and users of these security products are asked about how they're securing their APIs, the APIs that they're developing in their business, they admit that there's a lot more to be desired. Now, as I was thinking through this dichotomy of how one, on the one hand, wants to benefit from the use of APIs, we do not nearly do enough to secure the APIs that we develop ourselves. And I recently came across a really well-written article in the HBR titled APIs Aren't Just for Tech Companies, written by Matt McLarty and Tiffany Wang. Now, the article struck a chord with me because it outlined a way of thinking that I felt could be used to resolve this dichotomy that I'm speaking about. They talk about the ways of the API, and I quote from their article. Any business with a website or a mobile app already has much of what's needed to offer APIs. But it's not enough to arbitrarily open up APIs to the web. They go on to say that companies that have been most successful with APIs display a common set of thinking patterns and practices, something they call the ways of the API. I subsequently connected with Matt and Tiffany, and we agreed to do a couple of episodes to explore the security aspects of APIs that are actually overlooked. My argument here is that API insecurity is the unknown for businesses today. And to take that conversation forward, joining me today is Matt McLarty, who is the co-author of the article that I referred to. He's also the global leader for API strategy at MuleSoft. He's co-authored a book on microservices, and he's the co-host of a podcast called The APIs Unplugged. Matt, welcome to Security in the Fast Lane.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here. I'll spare my Olympic story since I'm based in Vancouver and actually had some colleagues fly over and stay in my basement during the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, but love to be here talking about APIs and security.
Thanks for being here, Matt. Before we get into our topic today, I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you got into the world of APIs, and it'd be great if you could talk about some of the interesting projects that you're currently working on, now as much as you're permitted to share, of course.
Sure. Yeah. My background, when I started my career, I was working at a software company in Toronto and then a bank, and the same thing, which was connecting into this. It was kind of the way the banks networked together to provide credit card authorizations, point of sale focused. There was also some, networking between banks to support cash withdrawals across the different banks. So, we weren't calling it APIs at that point, more like just baseline network connectivity. But I really started already in this sort of digital ecosystem space where you had to connect up services between banks. While I was at the same bank, I got more and more into integration as I'm dating myself here, right? This is the late 90s. The e-commerce is just becoming a thing. The web is just becoming a thing. And, there was more and more desire to provide standing up online banking, exploiting that channel. We needed to use a lot of the same back-end services that were available to the branch channel and even to the telephone banking channel and so on. So integration became a fundamental part of what we're doing at the bank, and I got into that. Eventually started looking, got involved across the entire organization, leading an initiative at the time, migrating to service-oriented architecture using web services technology. So all these things are going on, and no one's really using the term API too prominently. But at that time, when I left the bank, I actually joined IBM, and that was all focused on XML and, interestingly for this podcast, big security focus around securing XML interfaces inside companies and outside companies. And, web services started in the early 2000s with an initial focus on, hey, this is a way we can start connecting different companies across the web. They were sort of hijacked and people started using web services more as an internal integration mechanism. But since then, and especially since the mobile boom of 2008, 2009, there's been a much bigger focus on this idea of the API economy and opening up services over APIs. And I made another move around that time to focus exclusively on the API space. I started a global group within the company I was working at called the API Academy, where around 2012, right when those London Olympics were happening, we launched this group to focus on strategy, architecture, and design around APIs. And so, I guess I'm a veteran of the API economy, but I had the great fortune of joining MuleSoft in 2019, where my role is to just work with companies around the world, helping them identify business opportunities for using APIs, whether those are inside or outside, but increasingly really helping companies find those patterns that we talk about in the article that will help their businesses. And they really are sort of universally applicable.
That's great. I think as you were talking about service-oriented architecture and integration, it also took me back a few years, and I guess I'm dating myself now, thinking about pub/sub, message-oriented architecture, SOAP XML, the kitchen caboodle, right?
Yeah, everything old is new again, right? Like, I think it's funny you mentioned events, like that's all the rage now, right? We could do a whole other discussion about convergence of APIs and event-driven, even though event-driven is just as old as APIs.
Yeah, it's either like a sinusoidal curve or a complete circle, whatever you like, right? Now, yeah, let's kind of pick up on those three ways of the APIs that you and Tiffany have written about. And let me kind of read them out, and then we'll get into each one of them one by one, discuss what they are, and then try to extend that conversation to talk about security as well. The first one that you've written about is called the Unbundling Way. The second one is the outside-in way, and the third one is kind of the ecosystem way. We'll go through each one of them, but from my vantage point, I think this is a really useful and relatable paradigm for the chief information security officers and the security architects and professionals that we deal with, for them to start thinking about API security as well. Now, when we talk about the unbundled application, I think my mind goes to is each one of the unbundled part of the applications completely secure? When we talk about the outside-in way, I'm thinking, are my customers who use the APIs instead of the monolithic web or mobile application secure? And when you talk about the ecosystem way, I'm thinking, have I created risk for my ecosystem partners, or am I inheriting risk from my ecosystem partners? Is that kind of the way you guys have also been thinking about these three ways?
Yeah, and I think it's great to look at them through the security lens. I think just to talk about the article and the theme around, hey, this is not just for tech companies. It's really about observing these patterns from who we would look at as the envied leaders in the digital space, right? The biggest companies. I like to talk about, the web is 30 years old this year, and at least five of the top 10 brands in the world didn't exist 30 years ago because they're all sort of started as web startups. But I think when you're looking through the security lens, what's interesting is everyone wants to copy these companies and what they've done, and the patterns that we put out there are certainly the patterns that are evident in these companies. But what they didn't do really well was security and trust, right? And I think that each of the digital giants has had a hiccup along the way where they made bad assumptions that led them into breaches and trouble, or in some cases, let's face it, by design, they were sort of exploiting the trust relationship with their customers or ecosystem partners. So, yeah, I think that what we're intending to do with these ways of breaking down the digital space is to help with exactly whatever your perspective is, to sort of look at the world through digital eyes, and hoping that these ways will help see things that way. And really, if you read the article, they're not so much ways specifically of the API. I think that's a nice catchy way we're trying to have a catchy way of putting it, but it's really the ways of digital thinking that just so happens that APIs are really helpful in applying them. So to start with unbundling, right? I think this is a pretty obvious one, but a challenging one for organizations. It's somewhat paradoxical. Like, you want to decompose your organization in order to compose your organization, or compose processes and experiences for your customers. We've been talking at MuleSoft for years about this idea of a composable enterprise, being able to break your business capabilities down in such a way that they can be reconstituted and orchestrated for unanticipated opportunities. Because that's I think really what the digital space has taught us, is that things move so fast you can't really predict exactly what's going to happen. So be ready for anything. And that's where by breaking things down, by unbundling capabilities, it sets you up for that. And I think you mentioned the microservices book that I was involved in writing, and in there we're kind of talking about the power of unbundling capabilities in that way. But when you look at it from a security perspective, the most obvious thing is, okay, well, more interfaces, more access to these capabilities is more of an attack surface, right? And so you've got to be careful when in the rush to open things up, to make sure that you're opening them up appropriately, opening them up in a safe way. And we've seen breach after breach going back to the beginnings of the API economy, where usually it's just people haven't thought through what it means to put an API out there. I think one of the more famous ones was Snapchat when they launched, right? They were wildly successful, but their API got reverse engineered and hacked. And I think it was through that hack where people discovered that when Snapchat was saying that your pictures are only temporarily stored, they weren't telling the truth of that one. So they got exposed. But the reason they got breached is because they didn't think they had a public API. They said, we didn't open an API up for third-party developers. We only have this API for our mobile app. Well, as soon as you have an API powering your mobile app, you have a public API.
That's exactly right. So let's kind of, I want to put on a couple of strands there, right? So when developers are creating API for software, right, arguably the gap between a developer's machine and the production machine is shortened because the API is ready to go. You test it, you've got CI/CD in place, and you can immediately deploy it, and there's a lot of immediate gratification. Now, I think one of the challenges that at least I find with customers is there's no dearth of APIs. As a matter of fact, there are more number of APIs than they'd care to admit. Is one of the first challenges here is getting an inventory of all the APIs. And why is it so difficult to get an inventory of all the APIs? Because there should be a better way of basically enlisting all the APIs that you have in the organization, and then at least having all of them in a central kind of repository, so you know which APIs are actually available publicly.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, as the software landscape becomes more complex and distributed, right? We're always, our urge is to have everything perfectly managed and perfectly, autonomic environments, right? Where things are detected and fixed without people even knowing about them. That's nirvana. But the reality for most enterprises or most companies in general is like a great first step is just being able to see what's going on, right? Visibility, observability is step one. And what you're describing is absolutely a security consideration. You can't secure what you can't see. But there's power even beyond that, right? You can't monitor, or you can't manage what you can't see. Developers can't discover what they can't see. So the same problems that lead to security issues can also just lead to inefficiencies because, for an internal API, for example, things get built and rebuilt and redundant services, spring up because people just don't know what's available. And especially in fast moving environments. I think Uber is an example of that, where they talked a lot about their microservice landscape and ended up with, I think, 5 times as many APIs or microservices as they had developers, right? Like five microservices per developer didn't seem too efficient. But from a security standpoint, absolutely, you need to know what's there. And I think that, this is why being able to sort of plug in and see the landscape, MuleSoft, we talk about this notion of an application network, whereas as opposed to thinking about everything being centralized in actual centralized runtime, think about a network view. How do you kind of get a planar view across the landscape so that you can enforce that type of management? I think that one of the tricks that's going on as well, this falls in line with what you're just saying, is that we've gone from this monolithic world where you might have applications all running within a single platform, let's say a J2EE app server or something like that, where you could have system-wide enforcement of operational needs and security policy enforcement. When you get distributed and you're running some stuff in your data center and some stuff in the cloud and you've got multi-cloud, how do you do things like enterprise-wide security policy enforcement that you have to normalize? That's where I think looking at APIs as sort of a universal access mechanism is helpful, because at least you have one way of getting to things. But then you need the ability to see where all the things are and then apply the policies.
Right. So let me kind of throw something out here. Love to get your opinion on this, right? As you were kind of explaining this whole composability and interconnected nature of these APIs and microservices, 2 thoughts popped up into my head, right? One was, look, from a network perspective, we already have this concept of building out a network map, and people get that. But also from a software development point of view, again, I might end up dating myself. Think about OR mapping, right? Remember how we used to do OR mapping? Some form of a combination of the both is kind of necessary in today's API-first composable world to be able to get a good picture of what the attack surface and all the potential injection points could be. So do you think, let me kind of pose the question then, do you think with that background, could we go to the Chief Information Security Officer and the security architects and make a recommendation saying, look, you've got to take a step back, work with engineering, work with infrastructure, and put together the application network that you at MuleSoft talk about. But at a higher level, what's this API network that exists within your organization. If you can't get a good feel of that, how are you going to get a good feel of how secure you are?
Yeah, exactly. And I think another thing that APIs do is another reason why it's important and effective to move to sort of this, what we call API-led connectivity, where you're normalizing access across the systems, is what you described. It's pretty hard to try and tunnel down into the depths of every single application in your environment, right? I mean, there have to be some security and trust that is delegated to the owners of those applications. But, there's a great book that I was put onto a couple of years ago called The Art of Systems Architecting. Oh, I hope I got that right. By Eberhard Rechten. Anyway, there's a line in there about, in a complex system, the greatest leverage is at the interfaces. And I think that it is possible if you take that network view and say, okay, well, at least we know where all the APIs are, then, and understanding the dependency chain there, I think is fundamental. As you described, if you're trying to find systemic issues and threats across the landscape, you have to understand how the system works, right? All the interconnected distributed bits work together. And it's not possible to try and tunnel into the depths of every one of those components. So you kind of look at how the components in the system interact, and then that's a really helpful view. I think the challenge is that trying to map, we've seen this, you've got the experience I have, in the enterprise, there's been lots of efforts by enterprise architects to map the entire landscape, and they do a great job, and then it's out of date 5 seconds after they finish the work, right? So the other thing is having an actual organic view of the application network, so that when changes happen, they're reflected in the view. And that's something that we have tooling to provide that level of dependency viewing. I know that there's actually a whole category of companies that have sprung up with that sort of mindset of mapping the API landscape and dependency chains. Companies like Akita Software and Optic and Traceable, who are all really looking at how they can dynamically discover the API map and then understand the dependencies in order to enforce things like monitoring and security.
Totally makes sense, right? I think as an extension, if I may offer an extension to kind of your first way, what we're really saying is, if you're a chief information security officer or somebody responsible for security, what we need to start thinking about is both a static and dynamic exercise where statically you work with enterprise architects, the enterprise architecture team, and get a point in time view of what the application or API network looked like, but also engage with providers of observability and traceability type tools. Traceable AI is certainly one that I've been following lately, to be able to keep that map up to date. So I think that's a great extension of kind of your first way from a security point of view to get that visibility and to get a good handle on what your API landscape, interconnected API landscape looks like. Now let's kind of pivot and talk about kind of your second way, which is the outside in way. Essentially thinking about who your potential customers are. It could be an app. It could be an end user like my friend who got tickets into the Olympics using the API, or it could be a partner. Did I get that right?
Yeah. I mean, it could be people you intend to use the API. And actually, when we talk about outside in from a design perspective, from a functional standpoint, we're primarily aiming at those intended users. But definitely from a security standpoint, you've got the whole other unintended consumers, right? Who on the outside could possibly access the API that you don't want to access the API. And so, always thinking about what the exposure of the API from a security design standpoint, I think is equally important. So I think this is one of the pitfalls for sure, that on one hand, we really push companies to think clearly about who their customer segments are, who their intended targets are. But at the same time, that's one hurdle to get over. Then once they're there, you got to also say, but then there's everybody else who could cause problems, and you have to think about that from a security design standpoint.
Right. So if I had to kind of put my product management hat on, what you're really saying is you always design the use cases, but did you think about the use cases from a security standpoint?
Yeah, that's definitely a way of putting it. And I mean, there's an element of you can't anticipate every problem either. And so, when we were talking earlier about, defense in depth, of course, right, from a security perspective, you've got to have principles around the access control for your APIs that are, look at trust levels, and you have to also think about how do you do anomaly detection in edge cases, and even as you alluded to earlier, thinking through the design from the engineer's perspective, right? Where problems can leak in. But I think if everybody in the chain is always thinking from the outside in, always thinking about the consumer's perspective, then this is helpful. It helps frame it if people are thinking from that perspective instead of getting too myopically focused on the internals of the service.
But let's kind of double click that for a minute. What if we had to get myopically focused on the internals of the service for just 1 minute, right? And where I'm going with this is this, right? Today, developers are able to take the business logic that they've written and pretty much with the click of a button or adding an annotation, they can turn it into an API, right? It's as simple as that. The cost of APIfication is very low. You start out, write your business logic, get the right annotations, use the right framework, click a button, lo and behold, you have an invocable service. Now, what I think, if we get myopic, what I think is really essential is looking at some basic security principles around identity, authentication, authorization, and auditability, right? The IAAA. Who are you? Are you who you say you are? Are you allowed to access this resource? And once you've invoked the service or the API, is there auditability and traceability? Now, is that in your mind the developer's responsibility? Because ultimately, a lot of the tools and frameworks we have today allow the developers to skip that thinking and directly go to exposing their APIs, potentially publicly. So do you think that those are conversations we need to have with developers in the first place?
So just to go back to where the question started, is it possible to take your code and plug it in and just generate an API and open it up and away you go? That's possible. I think what the outside-in way teaches us is that's not a good approach, right? Because you don't know if what you have in the internals of your application are going to be what your consumers need. So really thinking through the consumer needs is vital. And I personally don't I think it's vital that developers are thinking from their consumers' perspective. So they may not be the ones implementing the identity management, the authorization. They probably will have a stake in if there's any sort of fine-grained authorization going on, because oftentimes the rules required there's some mixing of business logic and what you do there. So I think on one hand they can count on platform capabilities. You don't want each application developer reinventing the security model, but they should still be responsible citizens and should be at least viewing their service from the outside world. I don't think we've talked about this before, but I actually co-authored another O'Reilly book. It's a short one about securing microservice APIs, and in there we've got a framework for thinking about access control in a distributed landscape. And a lot of that there's a model in there that's based on this idea of trust domains. And so I think, domain thinking, which we've applied a lot in the microservices world from a business standpoint, can be applied in the security world a lot and helps, the same way that domain-driven design helps groups of people be on the same page and talk. I think that can be done in the security world as well, because going back to that whole idea of the dependency chain, the developers are going to be in some sort of trust context, and they should at least know who their consumers are, even if they're not close to the ultimate end consumer who may be on outside of the company.
Right. That makes sense, right? As a developer, it would be great if I could get a set of requirements that capture exactly that, who the intended end users are and what are the rest of the abuse cases that I should at least think about when I design the software. I think that's clearly a key extension in my head from a security point of view for the outside in way, right? For a product manager to come in and really put some elbow grease into defining what some of those abuse cases, at least from identity, authentication, authorization, and auditability point of view, should be. The second piece that I want to propose here, and Matt, I want to kind of get your view from a CISO or a security leadership perspective. There could be a framework that security leaders adopt that basically allows or disallows a microservice or an API to become public or not. Right? There has to be some kind of a gate, a set of questions that get asked before you actually push an API out to the public domain.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that, some of the more mature API organizations I've worked with have developed practices around that. Not exclusively for security, but across the board in terms of production readiness. Security is one aspect of that. They've done a good job, for example, in consolidating access to external APIs. So when the organization is the consumer, there's a whole risk discussion around the consumption of other APIs. That's important. In fact, there's one of our podcast episodes on APIs Unplugged worked with a fellow Vancouverite named Baljit Malhotra, who's a real domain expert in risk management for consumption of APIs. But yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think, again, going back to, having the gate process in place is fundamental, but then you also need to make sure it's developer friendly. So the earlier you can get the principles in the developer's mind so that they don't get to the end of their development and hit a wall, right, is good. And also, it once again raises the point of making sure that the net is wide enough that you're capturing all of the APIs and that you don't have a gate process that 20% of the APIs go through and then people miss 80% because they didn't realize they were APIs that they were developing. So definitely, I think that's an important part of the process, and then we've seen good practices around how to make that flow as smoothly as possible.
Right. That's great. So let's kind of pivot the conversation to the third way, the ecosystem way that you outlined in your article. Now, a couple of months ago, I think it was in March this year, I wrote a piece about what I was calling then de-risking business partnerships in an app-driven economy. And my argument in that piece was that traditional business risks come from inheriting a partner, right? What if the partner is insolvent? Or what if they close shop? But I think the more contemporary business risks, around cybersecurity especially, come from inheriting a partner's applications. To be more precise, in this case, they come from inheriting applications through API-based integrations. Now, is that one of the directions you were headed in when you were writing about the ecosystem way?
Yeah, I what we've seen from a risk standpoint in partnerships, just kind of API practices, it's a huge, first of all, it de-risks a lot around the time investment, the financial investment to get partnerships up and running. I think that's just a given. I think from a security standpoint, I would go a step further and say it's about custodial responsibility for data, right? In that, if you're in a three-legged API chain, everybody has to be responsible for data. And so understanding what the classification is for the data, respecting regulations, that's really the big challenge. And I think it's something that isn't thought through enough yet. So I definitely think API partnerships are extremely powerful, right? We've seen startups like Lyft and Uber and others who essentially build a whole business on top of a bunch of back-end APIs, scale up very quickly. But there's data implications. There's long-lasting dependency implication. If you build a dependency, then you're basically banking a lot on your future. on that API provider. So there's a lot of considerations there. I think that, the ecosystem way, specifically the way we're writing about it, really leads into this whole idea of value networks, which is something that came out of Clayton Christensen, where we think about business models and ecosystems from the perspective of what value is being exchanged in each of the links within that value network. So it's hard to depict it's hard to describe just through audio, but you imagine that you've got end customers and you've got your company and then you've got all the touch points in between and behind to deliver value to those customers. There's a lot of different value that is exchanged. And we may think of money as value, but products and services are value. Data is value these days, especially. And then there's a bunch of intangible values, like reaching a certain reach is a value in terms of how you can get out to other markets. Time savings is value. If you can be like Twilio and speed up the developer process, that's value. But one of the elements of value we see in there that's big is really trust and security. And I know that's going to be the topic of the future conversation with Tiffany. But really, I think this is where we flip the whole conversation around on security from how do you protect things and how do you be responsible, which is all important, to how can you even make security and trust a value proposition that you can commercialize for your organization. And we've seen examples of companies doing that. So I think, to me, that when thinking about the ecosystem way, I think that's the real game changer, is how can you take your good practices in security and turn that into a fundamental part of your business model. And I think there's a lot of potential to do that.
If we think about a way to kind of implement that thought process, in the absence of a certification or a standard for APIs, right? Is there something that you could do from a voluntary disclosure perspective, right? At least let me kind of walk through the process in my mind. As an organization, you've identified that APIs are the future, and you want to be responsible API developers. And what does it mean to be responsible API developers? Here are the good API practices that we're going to put in place and we're going to voluntarily disclose. Now, if you do that, if you make a voluntary disclosure about your API policy around trust and security and the measures that you take within the organization, I think that can drive a lot of the behavior change that we need within the organization to think about APIs as a first-class kind of economic unit of the business, right? You go there and you declare what your stand on trust and security from an API perspective is, what are the best practices that you follow and you can evidence, and that becomes a standard for all the APIs that have been developed and will be developed in the future. Is that one way to kind of implement this vision?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that actually reflects what I was just describing, which is, let's say you're a potential API consumer and you're looking at two companies, and one of them has been very forthright about here's our security practices, here's our approach, here's what we do with the data we collect, here's what we want you to do with the data that we provide, here's our promise to customers, and so on. Versus a company that's just like, here's our API, you can use it. There's a very clear differentiation there, and I think that because of maybe some of the consequences of the API economy or the social media phase of the Web 2.0, right? I think everybody's more aware. We've seen government regulation responses to use of data. There's just this air of suspicion that's going on. I think that companies that can not only assert their principles around security and trust, but prove them, are the ones that I think will really rise above in this next phase that we go into.
Exactly. No, look, Matt, I think this article that you and Tiffany wrote, it's certainly sparked a bunch of thoughts in my head, and I'm glad we were able to talk about all three ways and actually talk about some actionable insights, so to say, right, for each one of those three ways around figuring out what your visibility strategy is. If you're a security leader within an organization, figure out what your visibility strategy is. Figure out from an outside-in perspective how you're going to translate the use cases, abuse cases to technical implementation, put together a framework to determine what makes it to the public domain or not from an API perspective. And the last one being put in place almost like a voluntary self-disclosure framework and set of best practices around not just APIs, but also the data that these APIs access and store. Matt, thanks for taking the time, and I'd say congratulations once again on a really well-written article. Like I said, it hit home for me, and hopefully it'll hit home for a lot of the people who listen to our podcast.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on. It's been my pleasure.
For our listeners, I'll make sure we add all the links to the various topics that we discussed with Matt in the show notes. And finally, a quick shout out to the producers for the show, Herman and Lauren. Thank you for making this a breeze. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Security in the Fast Lane, brought to you by White Hat Security. To learn more, visit us on the web at www.whitehatsec.com.